And now I would like to introduce our Executive Director, Peter Arnold.
Thanks, Anya. Welcome everybody on Summer Friday. This is, I think, our 7th week of Summer Scholar Series presentations. We're really excited about today's, which is a discussion with Antwaun Sargent on Virgil Abloh's Figures of Speech exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum. We're really pleased that Antwaun's joining us. Antwaun, among many roles, is currently a director at the Gagosian Gallery, and he led in the curation of Virgil's Figures of Speech exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum. Antwaun's joined by Matthew Yokobosky, who is the senior curator of fashion and material culture at the Brooklyn Museum. He's well recognized for his work on many iconic exhibitions, including the Brooklyn Museum's Christian Dior Designer of Dreams exhibition. Thank you for that one, Matthew. I'm going to turn it over to the two of you and encourage you to make this really conversational. As Anya said, there'll be questions, guys, that will come up. Anya and I will, at the end, pose those questions to you. So don't worry about what might pop up on the screen. So Matthew, why don't I turn this over to you now?
Okay, thanks so much for the introduction. It's so great to see everyone this morning. So we've been asked to talk a little bit about our histories first. So I've been working in museums for over 35 years now, and my degree originally was in cinema studies and design. So one of my first jobs was working as an assistant in as a film and video curator at the Carnegie Museum. And after that, I was offered a job in the film and video department at the Whitney Museum. And so I was working on film and video series, but in the evenings, I was off Broadway. There's a theater called La Mama that was started by Ellen Stewart. And I was doing sets and costumes at La Mama. And one of those projects won a Bessie Award for sets and costumes. And the next day I came into the Whitney and they said, have you ever considered doing exhibition design? Which I really hadn't. And they started asking me to design shows. So I was kind of moonlighting at my day job doing that. I designed things like the Joseph Stella retrospective, several of the biennials in the 90s, worked closely with Barbara Haskell and Thelma Golden, who were curators there at the time. And then I got a call from Arnold Lehman, who was the director of the Brooklyn Museum, and he said, I'm not so interested in film and video, but would you be interested in kind of switching your career trajectory and coming to the museum as an exhibition designer? And I did that for about 15 years, and then Ann Pasternak came in as the director, and one of the first things we did was the David Bowie retrospective, and she'd asked me both if I would curate and design it. So I was wearing 2 hats for that show. It did really well, and afterwards Anne said, I'd like to switch you back to curatorial. So I became the curator of fashion and material culture. So my career's kind of had 2 paths, design and curation. And that's a little bit about me. Antwaun.
Yeah, I mean, that Dior show was amazing, and the Bowie show. I happened to see both of them. My background is somewhat different. I went to Georgetown, studied politics there, and thought I would go into politics, and was Hillary Clinton's intern, and worked on a lot of Democratic campaigns when I was in college, and then, you know, it came the time to sort of decide what I wanted to do, and I didn't really sort of have an idea. And there were sort of like 2 paths. My friends from college were all going into sort of like law or finance, and so I applied for a finance job, and then there was also this sort of thing called Teach for America. And I applied for that, a job in finance and a job and Teach for America to teach in Black and Brown communities. And I sort of just, really didn't have a passion for either, quite frankly. I just was like, I really like to, in some ways, give back, or like I need to become, in some ways financially stable. I grew up in Chicago. And so those are sort of the realities of sort of a first generation kid who was sort of trying to figure out like what was possible. And so I decided, instead of taking the finance job, to teach in New York, in Black community in Brooklyn, deep in Brooklyn, East New York, Brooklyn, at a charter school. And I sort of moved to New York and started to teach, and I taught kindergarten, taught kids how to read for 4 years. And while I was doing that, it's 5-year-olds are extraordinarily energetic, but for a 21-year-old, it's not the most exciting job. And so I sort of fell in with an art crowd in New York. And by day I was teaching, kids how to read, and by night I was going to openings, going to artist studios. And at some point someone goes, well, what do you do? Like, what do you do in this world? Why are you at all these openings? Why are you in the artist studios? Why are you hanging out with artists and curators and writers and all those things? What is your contribution? And I was like, well, I can write, so maybe I'll become maybe I can write about, these artists that I'm visiting and had sort of grown obsessed with. And so I started writing, pitching stories and, writing advice. And there was this thing at the time called Creators Project, and, was paid very little money to do it, but I was extraordinarily excited to have an opportunity to talk to artists and to learn no more about their creative process, and what made them tick, what are their concerns, how are those concerns expressed materially in their practice. And so for the last 8 years, I taught for 4 years and stopped teaching, and then to focus more on the writing. And so I was just writing about artists, particularly Black artists, because at the time there wasn't sort of much being written about sort of young Black artists, or do you have like a handful of artists, Kennedy Wiley, McLean Thomas, sort of Glenn Ligon, those sort of superstar artists sort of being written about. But then there was like this whole other world of young artists trying to make it, and who wanted to talk to someone about their practice and about what they were thinking and where they were going and all of that. And so I just became that person, and just wrote all the time. And then a couple of years ago, 2018, Aperture Foundation, which is a photo foundation, invited me to co-curate a show. It was the first time that I had even thought about curating, but I had spent a lot of time with artists in museums, in galleries, in project spaces, sort of thinking about sort of what was on the wall. And so I accepted, that position, and I found it, in some ways really exhilarating. And we did this show called The Way We Live Now. It was a perspective on emerging photography from around the world. And then maybe 6 months after that, they were like, well, do you want to do a book? And I was like, yeah, maybe I do want to do a book. And they were like, well, what would you do a book on? And I just thought that, like, sticking with the idea of young artists, emerging artists, to do a book around young fashion photographers, or people who are working sort of in between fashion and art and across the world, Black photographers. And that became the new Black Vanguard, the photography between art and fashion. And then, a couple of years later, had a conversation with Larry Gagosian at the gallery and some other directors about sort of consulting then that led to my role as a director at the gallery, where I currently help program the 21 spaces around the world. And so I curate exhibitions and talks, and also contribute to our publications department, the magazine, as well, while maintaining an independent sort of curatorial practice and our independent writing practice. And so that's how, the sort of conversation started with the Brooklyn Museum and Virgil about curating Virgil's show at the museum. But that's me in a nutshell.
No, I think it's really interesting when you talk about photography between art and fashion. I think so much of Virgil's practice is about looking at that in-between space. The areas between one form and another form. And it's kind of, I think, what propels the exhibition a lot. I was looking at a talk you gave near the beginning of the opening of the show, and you start out talking about how he had studied architecture, but the exhibition is really in other sections. It's about music, it's about design, it's about fashion, it's about social space. And I think before this talk, I was really trying to think about those areas where it kind of blends together, which might have been the reason why you opened the exhibition with the collaboration with Braun, which includes an 85-minute mixtape, which you can hear on SoundCloud. And I think when you think about Virgil Abloh as a DJ, and the idea that a DJ is mixing so many different records together, and take that concept and then apply it to objects, so where you're taking different elements of objects and seeing how they relate together, it created a great platform to begin your exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Braun collaboration, we started the exhibition with the Braun collaboration because I think, as you said, Matthew, it really synthesizes like who Virgil is, as an artist, and how he worked across disciplines, right? And he really didn't sort of see boundaries. I think that was one of the things in sort of curating the show over the last 3 years that became very apparent to me, was that, there was no sort of, he did not believe in tradition, in that way. And he worked in a lot of ways across traditions, and sort of to insert himself in those traditions. And, with the Braun collaboration, you have so many things that's happening, there. You have this sort of the color of the speaker system that sort of speaks to the sort of tradition of Black music, both jazz and Houston hip hop. And then you also have this idea of like the European canon, Red Braun, and sort of the way that they sort of sit in the European canon as it relates to sort of consumer goods, right? And then you have, sort of this mixtape, right, which is sort of interesting because Virgil sort of invited, it starts sort of, it's like chopped and screwed like jazz, and then he invited these like rappers to sort of like also contribute. And so you have all of that sort of happening, but it sort of retains its sort of like, if you're sort of a design head, that this is a 1965 object from Braun, so he wanted to speak to multiple audiences with every object that he made, or and he famously called that tourist versus purist, right? And so he wanted to sort of make sure that folks who did not have an understanding, or who are just wasn't sort of up on something, right, to have an access point, but also to not leave behind, the purists, so to speak, people who like know exactly what the object is, when was made, why it was fabricated, how many units was, all of those things, those sort of like nerdy things. And so it really speaks to Virgil's, what I sort of think of as his democratic vision, and so that was so one way to sort of just capture the ethos of the artist, right, in the one object, in a sort of opening object. The other thing was that, as we all know, Virgil unfortunately passed away in late November of last year. And, this was something that he was working on at the time of his passing, right? And so I wanted to make sure that there was something in the exhibition that spoke to sort of his creativity in sort of the last moments, if you will, of his life, but also showed that, like, he really, 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 lived and breathed this stuff, like he was so committed to his practice and so committed to making art that, even in sort of what had to be an incredibly difficult, moment, right? He was still thinking about the ways in which his art was going to live in the world. And so I wanted to make sure that we had his voice, so to speak, right when you sort of opened the exhibition and sort of walked into the show. And so that, so we decided to go with the bronze sculpture. It was also something that was new. People hadn't seen it. Figures of Speech was a traveling retrospective or major survey, and it had been around the world. And so we wanted to make sure that the Brooklyn iteration had new objects and sort of spoke to new ideas that Virgil was sort of working on.
And I think when even the placement of like the words purist versus tourist are on the revolving doors as you enter into the museum, you're already kind of setting up that dichotomy where people actually, it's almost like they are already deciding whether they're a purist or not, or a tourist, or maybe they're verses.
That's also in relationship to its own practice, right? A lot of people know who Virgil Abloh is, but a lot of people don't, right? And so, like, one of the things with a museum exhibition, what you try to do is to make sure that, all audiences are considered. And so, that, like, yes, it was about sort of the objects, but it was also about, like, Virgil Abloh too, right? Are you a purist? Do you know every single thing that he, has done? And there are people, trust me, there are people out there walking through the exhibition, people are sending me to this day things on Instagram, like, did you know this? Did you, why didn't you put this in the show? Why did, it's like, which is sort of I think, honestly, I think it's amazing that you had someone who has so affected design and our culture in a way that a lot of people around the world also, feel like they have and they want to have, be in part of the exhibition in that way. People, I've now curated tons of exhibitions and I've never had someone, and had so many people reaching out and like, me and Virgil did this, you should include this. He was famously texting and famously on Instagram and just connecting with people, and it did not matter who they were. And so, people just sending me their Instagram exchanges go and like, why not put this in the show? Or, all of these, things that, and so, there were some real purists, Virgil Abloh purists out there, and there were some people who, didn't know who he was, right? And we wanted to sort of account for both of those audiences, right? And make sure that, at the very least, folks could sort of connect, even if you didn't know who Virgil Abloh was or his, his connection or impact on our culture, that you can sort of understand an artist's journey.
And I think also the title of the exhibition, Figures of Speech, which has been with the exhibition since Chicago. And for those who may or may not have seen it, it's been to Boston, it's been to Atlanta, it's been to Doha. The idea of the figures of speech, that you as a person, what you're wearing is saying something about you. When you start thinking about that, we are communicating non-visually all the time, though I think sometimes we think we're just putting on something very utilitarian. But
Right.
even that choice is saying something. So I think when Virgil then extended it by putting the actual word onto the garment or onto the t-shirt, it kind of started creating another dialogue because it actually included language, which, for example, when, which you've talked about, where he put the word sculpture on a handbag. And you know, the very first collection that he did with his company Pyrex Vision, where he silk screened on ready-made clothes. So anyway, I'm rambling on here.
No, but I do think that like this notion of figure of speech is actually a sort of interesting one. And if we can unpack it for a second, you know, to your point, is that, you know, for him, it was about sort of, you know, actual figures who had lived and who have been inspirational, right, on one hand, right? So Michael Jordan and, you know, Joseph Beuys and Duchamp, but then he extended that to objects too, right? Like, you know, Mies van der Rohe, but also Alexander Calder, and, you know, then there's buildings, you know, Mies van der Rohe building in downtown Chicago. You know, there's a beautiful Alexander Calder sculpture that sits in front of that building. And, you know, and so those things also become, right. And then there's this, you know, in the shop, there's this David Hammons, when he was at the Royal Academy of Rome, did this work where on one of the white marbles, he threw all these fake Louis Vuitton bags onto it, right. And so like, you know, those sort of connections, right. And so those figures, themselves, but then he also, again, extending sort of this, having this sort of utilitarian or democratic vision, he also sort of want folks who enter, right, the exhibition themselves, he thinks of them as figures of speech, right, like figures in that way. And then also, you know, the guards, right, and so in the Brooklyn Museum show, the Chicago show, the Doha show, the Boston show, he also designed all the guards' uniforms and also special Nikes, you know, for them, right? And then so the guards themselves, the people who are often, you know, forgot about in a sort of museum setting, or who are often sort of, but you know, who are forgot about in the setting, but who spend literally the most amount of time with any art in a museum. He thought of them as figures, right? And he wanted to sort of elevate their status by sort of showing that he designed something especially for them. And then in Brooklyn right now, you know, the shoes that they're wearing, they're the only people in the world that are wearing those Nikes, and that has created quite, quite the stir. And so it was about value. It's about sort of why, you know, fundamentally we dress people, right? Why we get up in the morning and put on something, right? What are we trying to communicate? Notions of beauty, notions of, you know, who have been excluded from access to sort of beauty and fashion and empowerment and spaces like museums, but also out in the world, you know, at the very heart of his practice is, you know, we spoke about this a lot, is someone who was trained as an architect who never, that training never left him, right? And fundamentally what an architect does is, you know, constantly is reimagining space, right? The built environment often, but for Virgil, he took that sort of even further, reimagining, you know, not only the spaces, but also what was worn in the spaces, what were put in the spaces, how the spaces were designed, you know, so it became about sort of designing a whole world. And you know, one of the things that we also talked about, it was just like, you know, the world wasn't designed for him, you know, that and you talk about a 6'2", 6'3", you know, foot tall Black man, you know, like literally the world's not designed, you know what I mean? Like, and so like he was thinking about that, and he was thinking about how do you redesign a world, right? In that way. And I think that quote, you know, everything I do is for my 17-year-old self, is really prescient in the sense that he was always thinking about, you know, these notions of childhood, but also play, but also access. And, you know, and he sort of moved in a way where, you know, that he was about creating space for himself, but also for others, and everything that he did, from fashion to design to architecture. And you see that in the Brooklyn Museum exhibition, I mean, in a lot of different ways, but particularly on a monumental scale with the social sculpture, you know, which is his last architectural project as a living artist. And, you know, the sort of promise of that space is its sort of sociability, right? The active nature of that space, the fact that like different sort of artists and designers and students are activating that space constantly, you know, with their ideas, right? And so he created space for, in his, you know, major survey, he created space for others, right, to sort of express their ideas and have a platform. And so I think a lot about that in terms of like the architectural training. And then also, Virgil was famously a WhatsApper, and I didn't sort of use WhatsApp before I met Virgil, and boy did I get an education, and we basically curated the show by WhatsApp, because he was like constantly on the move, and I didn't even know that WhatsApp had the sort of level of functionality that it did, and so in the chats he was drawing things and then sending them and then redrawing things and then like editing documents and and all this stuff. And one of the things, as I was sort of gotten to know him and his team, he surrounded himself with a great, like, yes, rappers and famous people and all of that, but also a lot of architects, like there were a lot of architects on his team designing shoes, designing spaces, designing, sculpture, things like that. And so for me, it was like that architectural piece was really sort of important to who he became as an artist and how he, fundamentally organized and reorganized, the world.
I think too, the architectural part that I find so interesting, and of course it comes through with the references to Mies van der Rohe all the time, who of course was one of the great architects of kind of transparent glass buildings, is how often transparency comes up as a theme in his work. I think when you look at the first model in the show that he did, it looks like a glass building leaning over the river in Chicago. But then also Pyrex Vision, collaborations like on the Rimowa suitcase, which is transparent and clear. But then later on, when he does a collaboration with the artist Pablo Tozek, that artist brings in the idea of using the kind of smeared surface that you put on a glass window when you want someone not to see through it.
Right.
So I suddenly had this moment where I was thinking so much about transparency, but also what's opaque and what you're not seeing. And so this social space in the exhibition, which is kind of a house structure, is really about trying to create a space in which you can be transparent about information. And asking questions about like, what's your signature, or where do you fit into this conversation, and making space for yourself. And maybe that's a little bit what we were talking about today with the participants today in the discussion about how do you find yourself in your future? How do you find the space that you're going to occupy?
Yeah, like that thesis project, right? Like the sort of it's his thesis, the show. I mean, it's his literal college thesis project, right? And what's sort of interesting about that is, as you said, the transparency and how that sort of moves through like the materials that he uses too, right? It moves through sort of the actual sort of yes, it's like about the finished sort of object, right? But it's also about the sort of materiality, right? And so if you think about sort of the way that he's sort of even approaching design, it's around sort of using material that you can sort of easily sort of identify, right? And it was particularly around sort of using material that you could young people could go to the store, whether it's a hardware store or whatever, and pick up themselves. And, maybe he did something that sparks an idea and then they can make their own thing, right? And so that's why that model in particular, yes, you have the glass sort of transparent building, but the model itself is made from foam, right? And so like locally sourced, foam. You also have the tables, right? The tables he designed in the exhibition. For those who haven't seen these shown, the exhibition unfolds across these specially designed tables that Virgil made in collaboration with the Brooklyn Museum and his design studio, Alaska. And, just plywood, and he was about sort of making sure that the material, right, in which he built, his objects and it made his art was something that, you know, was easily accessible. And there was a transparency to it, right? You can see how those tables are made, right? Like there's no like, you know, like there's no sort of hiding, right, of the, you know, artist trick or whatever. There, and he wanted, you know, folks to be able to see that like these concepts, you know, his were in some ways, you know, sort of had a simple, you know, sort of gesture to them. And, you know, a lot of people sort of contest, you know, that notion, right? His 3% rule or what have you. But it really was, what I sort of loved about it was the intentionality, right? Like that was the sort of artistic gesture from Virgil Abloh. You see that with the Nikes, right? You see that sort of with him just like changing them ever so slightly, whether that's, you know, in terms of color, whether that's in terms of, you know, the writing, you know, the sort of, you know, graffiti mark or the Helvetica sort of use of that font, you know, like all of those things sort of are these sort of little shifts in those sort of designs to keep both the tourists and purists with him, but also to show that like the marks that he's making are sort of these sort of transparent things that folks can also, that sort of to sort of ignite the imagination, if you will, to for your own creativity, right? And so I think that like that was maybe one of the things that it was sort of misunderstood about the practice, was that it was about, you know, and then he did, you know, I must say he also did extraordinarily elaborate things at Louis Vuitton and you know, the sort of couture beaded dresses and, you know, all of, I mean, that was hours and hours and hours, you know, like, and from, you know, that sort of happened in a practice as well, but primarily what he was after was a deep transparency, primarily because, you know, like I would argue is because he never sort of gotten, you know, like, you know, Black and brown students and artists and things like that. The art world is sort of, in fashion world and design world and architecture world are these, you know, incredibly opaque places, right? Like you don't know where to start, right? You don't know like how to start. You don't know how to break in. You don't know, you know, who to talk to. You don't know, you know, and so they're designed to be these sort of elitist institutions. And so for Virgil, you know, using, you know, Mies van der Rohe as a point of departure or inspiration, if you will, was sort of about, you know, obsessed with this sort of notion of transparency, because if you had transparency, people could sort of readily understand sort of what routes might be possible for them, you know, for themselves, right? And that's just something that historically Black and brown artists, women artists, gay artists have not had in the worlds of culture. And so I think there was also this other thing, there's also this critique within those artworks about the spaces and the places in which he was certainly walking through. And, you know, and even, I mean, we had a long discussion about the Brooklyn Museum itself, right? And the history of the Brooklyn Museum being a place in New York, being a sort of one of the major institutions in New York, but actually sort of had a community-driven approach to their programming, right? And so the Brooklyn Museum is always thinking about community, right? And that's not necessarily sort of one of the organizing principles of other major institutions around the globe or in New York, right? And so Virgil called Anne, the way that the story is retold to me, and said, I really want to do this here because of the museum's commitment to community, right? And I think that, like, again, it goes back to this idea of intentionality. And it goes back to the idea of like, what type of artist are you, you know, are you going to be, right? And how you sort of show up. And that's what, you know, and so I was thinking about this idea of community a lot, because Virgil thought about this idea of community all the time, right? Even, I mean, I will never forget going to the Atelier in Paris at Louis Vuitton in 2020, February 2020, right before that show, and walking in, and it's like all 20-year-olds, you know, like working in his atelier, right? And I was like, I've been to a lot of fashion houses, and I've not, I mean, it's usually sort of middle-aged, you know, sort of white women, you know, who have, you know, sort of certain skills in terms of like the, you know, dressmaking and all of that when you think about European fashion houses. And I'm like, how do you, I was like, and so I just like went around, started asking, like, where are you from? Sedan, where are you from? Harlem, where, you know, all these, like, London, you know, all these places. And I go, where did you, like, one, you know, kid told me that Virgil messaged him on Instagram out of the blue and go, I really like your style, you should come work for me. Like, you know, like, you just, so you had it sort of conceptually in the practice, but you also had it in the sort of actual sort of structuring of his design house and his studios. Tawanda, who runs Alaska, which is the design arm of Virgil Ablow's studios, guessed his Virgil's email and emailed him, guessed his email, and then emailed him. And then a couple of days later, Virgil responds. And Tawanda, told him that he, wanted to work for him, loved what he was doing in the world, etc. They start up a dialogue. They talk for about 6 months, and then Virgil comes back and say, "Hey, I got a project for us." And he's like, "Okay, cool. What's the project?" And the project was IKEA, which becomes this, sort of phenomenon and sort of design, right? And so, he really sort of lived it, and it wasn't just conceptual. I wanted to make sure that those aspects of his practice that people don't necessarily see, because this wasn't a guy who were out here shouting, "Look, I hired this kid," or "I did this," or, he didn't sort of operate that way. He just moved, through the world. I wanted to make sure that that was as much a part of the exhibition as the objects, right? Because I think that is sort of how he really sort of changed, art and culture.
Well, I think too, this idea of who's the collaborator is very important. I think when you look at his early career, he's interning at Fendi, he's being asked to work for Kanye. Those are very amazing places to begin your career. And then he extends that himself later when he's bringing in collaborators to work with. But it's again that kind of high-low transparency happening, where it could be somebody he meets on Instagram or WhatsApp, but it could also be Takashi Murakami, or it could be his.
He was sitting in a corner in the studio when I was there.
Oh,
yeah.
That's so great.
Yeah.
Takashi's crazy. It was crazy for me when I first walked through the show and I was thinking about Kanye, because when we did the Takashi Murakami retrospective at Brooklyn, Kanye actually performed in the exact space that Virgil's exhibition is in.
Oh, wow.
So, and that was in 2007 or 2008, and it was a time when Kanye was performing with the 6 women who were playing violins behind him,
right,
for Diamonds from Sierra Leone. I think his collaborations are very interesting, and when you look, for example, like at the t-shirts that were designed specifically for the exhibition, and it has all the different badges on the back of it, I looked at them and I just thought it's an opportunity for people to also be collaborative with the objects that they're buying. They can add more symbols and more signs to those t-shirts to create their own dialogue. And I think that's part of the question that you always ask when you're designing or curating an exhibition is, what's the exhibition going to become once the people are in the space? What is it going to be like to create this new dialogue? And I think what you've created with Virgil before he passed away is a very mesmerizing and fresh experience. Normally when you make an exhibition, you're not making long tables that are kind of like Donald Judd minimalist. And then on top of them, you're displaying, 20 prototypes for sneakers for Nike. Which is showing this very active, transparent mind way of thinking about how to progress the design of a sneaker. And so by the time you get to the actual installation of clothing in the exhibition, you already feel like you're looking at something that's edgy, that he's trying to bring something new to the dialogue. I think one of the ones I liked the best was a collection he did called Mirror Mirror, where
Mhm.
I was
Yeah.
actually trying to design the outfits for a band that didn't exist. I
Mhm.
mean, I think that's kind of like a dream project we all wish we had.
Right. You know, the thing, there were so many levels to this exhibition. I mean, um, one being, the fact that he, passed towards the end of the creative process around the exhibition, wanted to, exhibitions is, for those who don't know, they're usually set, maybe a year or so before like they go up and all of that. And you have everything, you have a plan, you have a second plan, you have a third plan, you are really sort of locked in sort of way before. Things don't change. You have a set checklist, especially at museums, galleries work differently. It's you have a lot more flexibility generally, but like especially with a major sort of traveling show, because there's so many different sort of people in terms of like where you're borrowing the work from. There's different institutions involved, and who can oversee different things. And then when you're talking about sort of objects like clothing, you have the conservation, you have all of you have all of that stuff. And then you have like whatever the borrower's demands are. So Louis Vuitton has a certain set of demands. Off-White has a certain set of demands. His archive, where we got some of the sort of homework from high school and college and all of that, have a certain set of demands. And then you have the space itself where in terms of like how much light, how much off-gassing a material might, an object might give. So you have you have all of these layers that you have to think about. And usually, because you have so many different moving parts and so many, key stakeholders, and that's not to mention the museum itself and how each museum runs very differently from one to the other. And you have to have all that stuff set, right? With this particular exhibition, we didn't have a final design for the house until, maybe like right before he passed, maybe, right? So this is less than 6 months out, right? And so that's a design, not the building of the thing. We started building this 3 months before the exhibition opened. And so there was an incredible amount of flexibility that had to sort of be, and grace, might I add, that had to be displayed, and that's the backdrop against COVID and wood shortages and, all of these other sort of things. And so to even, pull it off was just like, I mean, it still is remarkable even sort of to think about it. And I had never, sort of worked that way, certainly, and don't plan on working that way again, I must say. But I love the fact that, when you put an object on a table, right? That is not a normal way to display anything, basically, in a museum, because there's a lot of concerns around security. There's a lot of concerns about sort of like whether audiences will touch things. There's a lot of concerns about sort of walking, you put something on a table, this sort of human instinct is to walk on up to the table and touch the thing, because that's what we do, right? Like that's the normal sort of function, right? And so there's a lot. And then to throw on top of that, these are Virgil Abloh objects, which are some of the most sought after objects in the world, generally. And so there was a lot of sort of conversations around sort of like, how do you do this in a way that you don't have objects damaged, by the end of this, but you sort of stick to the artist's vision. And so there was a lot of sort of conversations around that. And, it was a lot of sort of like just having to sort of like get everybody on board around that, and like figuring out ways to like everything on the table, whether it seems like it or not, is actually sort of in some way, shape or form, fastened to the table. And so you had to sort of figure out that design, sort of, how do you sort of design, through that, right? And you're talking about 100+ objects, right? And each one of them needed a particular sort of design to make it look like it was just laying on the table, right? And that's not to mention in Chicago, at MCA, when the show opens there, someone walked into the into one of the galleries. And the Chicago show was, you know, typical sort of museum sort of layout. There were no tables, etc. And just picked up a box of t-shirts and walked out of the museum with them. And so like you had that sort of in the background that like, oh my God, someone, you know, walked into the museum and was so brazen. You know, Virgil laughed at that. He was just like, that's amazing. You know, he was sort of like this, and you know, the museum, I'm sure had, you know, existential, you know, sort of breakdown, you know, meltdown, because, you know, when objects are at a museum, they're in the care of the museum, right? And the museums take that very, very seriously. And it's more serious than I had even imagined, you know, like in a lot of ways. And, you know, and so to have this type of offering, I say all that to say, to have this type of offering, where folks can walk up to the table in certain parts and really get really close to things, and everything is basically a prototype, you know, and so it's one of one. It's ideas that, you know, Virgil had, and some of the stuff was released, or some of the stuff were shown, and some of the stuff just went to his archive and were just ideas that an artist had that, you know, was not meant for public consumption or in that way, right? In the way that, like, you know, he sort of obviously worked between commerce and sort of non-commercial, you know, sort of settings. And so it really was like, you know, which confounded, you know, sort of the obstacles, because you're like, this is a one of a one. There's only one of these shoes that exists in the world, you know, like this is not, you know, something that he's released and then we just got one of them and they were in the world in that way. And so there are like books like that, and their shoes and their shirts and their, you know, all of these sort of, you know, objects that are just sort of one of one. And for, you know, he was so adamant that like, no, this is the way that we have to do this. This is the sort of offering. I really want people to really pay attention to sort of not just like the value of the object or like how cool it is or the end product, but really to understand the construction of each of these objects, you know, and that's why sort of the fashion sort of, the show follows a chronological sort of approach. And I wanted to sort of show this artist's journey. I wanted to show Virgil's journey, right? Like it just didn't happen overnight that he became one of the, you know, most influential designers, you know, in the world, artists in the world. He started somewhere. He practiced, you know, there are old sketches. He's working on his, you know, on his, there's in the early part of the exhibition, it shows him working on these different type settings, right? And so he's drawing them by hand over and over and over and over again, to show that, you know, artists practice and artists try ideas, and some ideas don't work, but they lead to the next idea. That's why this sort of idea of a prototype is important to this particular exhibition, because for Virgil, everything was a prototype. So everything was sort of in sort of becoming, right? And so one idea always led to the next, and it might sort of show up in a different sort of medium or in a different sort of artistic discipline, but it might have started from, you know, a shirt or a rug or whatever, you know, like in his last couture show, his rug in his office, he made a dress out of it, you know, like it was just like, you know, so it was like all of this, he was always just sort of constantly thinking about the world and how do you remake a world and how do you keep remaking that world and keep refining. And so, you know, as you get to the fashion, you know, you have gone through his creative journey that sort of that allows him to arrive at sort of the construction of garments as a way of constructing a different type of, you know, world. And yeah, and you know, I also should say, because you know, it wasn't with artists, you know, and particularly with living artists, there's always it's a dialogue, and there's a back and forth, and there really robust conversations, and there are, you know, really, and sometimes arguments, and then sometimes, you know, you're saying no, it has to be this way, and they're saying no, it has to be this way, and there's, you know, and that all certainly happened, you know, and I think that like that's just a part of the creative process, you know, and when you sort of respect each other, you know, when you're the curator and the artist, you know, have, you know, deep admiration, you can have those sort of conversations. You know, for example, Virgil didn't want any fashion in this exhibition, for, you know, like he wanted zero fashion. So that was like the starting point. And we had conversations, you know. He also, you know, wanted there to be 15 objects total and this entire exhibition. And, you know, so like you start in a certain place and then you sort of get to, you know, through conversation, get to another place. And that's what a sort of curator and an artist do with each and every exhibition. You know, no matter where it is, you sort of start, curator comes with some ideas, the artists come with other ideas, and you work through those ideas together to sort of try to sort of think about not only sort of the artist's perspective, the museum's perspective, but also all the audiences that you're trying to engage, right? Because at the end of the day, a museum setting versus say a gallery, and we talked a lot about sort of the different settings and things like that, is a sort of principally an educational principally has an educational mission, right? And so like, how do we make sure that sort of part of the mission is being fulfilled when an artist is presenting work, you know, at the at an institution? And so, which is very different than say a museum show or a gallery show that he would have had, right? Where you can sort of not have text, for example, you know, like the text on the wall or labels or things like that. He wanted none of that stuff. And so we had to have a lot of conversations about sort of orienting audiences and you know, how do we do this in a way that still allowed folks to sort of fully sort of come bring themselves to each and every object, but also provided some guidance, right? And so we there's very minimal text in the exhibition itself. And that's why we have these booklets, you know, as a sort of wayfinding opportunity, but also the booklets, what I love that were designed in-house at the Brooklyn Museum, what I love about those booklets is that they become something you can take away, where you have every description of every object, but you also have additional information about Virgil's practice, about the objects, about the context, about the cultural context, the historical context, all of those things. Sort of, you get to really dive deeper into sort of the object, and you know, and you get to sort of have that booklet as, you know, and it plays off of something that Virgil did with his Louis Vuitton shows, right? That he used to make these really exhaustive show notes where he explained every reference and he explained and he used Ablohisms and all of that stuff. And we wanted to make sure that because language and text were so important to the descriptions of the worlds that Virgil was trying to create, we wanted to sort of make sure that that was also something that was offered to each visitor.
Guys, I'm going to jump in, and Virgil used to not like that I was the timekeeper, but I am a little bit the timekeeper. Mm-hmm. So there are a bunch of questions, Matthew and Antwaun, that have come in. I just wanted the opportunity to ask you both a few of them before we close the session. The first one is really for both of you to consider. It's from Madav. Art curation ultimately funnels into cultural curation. How do you both feel responsible for this on your shoulders? In a talk with Tremaine Emery and Tawanda from Alaska, Tremaine alluded to a responsibility to bring back artistic authenticity to Supreme. How can the Brooklyn Museum and Gagosian further enter this dialogue for either of you guys?
You know, I think when Antwaun was
I'm thinking about it, sorry. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was
just a great question.
Yeah, you know, at the Brooklyn Museum, you know, we're definitely very community oriented, and a lot of the choices about what exhibitions are on the calendar and what works are in an exhibition, it's a very long thought process. You know, you definitely are thinking about community. You're not thinking about, you know, this kind of glass bubble approach that was typical for museums for a long, long time. And I remember in 1993, when I was at the Whitney, we were doing an exhibition, the 1993 Whitney Biennial, which many people called the politically correct biennial at the time. Mm-hmm. But it was really one of the first really big shows that was looking at bringing social issue from every artist in the exhibition. It wasn't just one artist having a conversation or two artists. It was much bigger conversation. And then the next year, Thelma Golden did the exhibition Black Male, which was a big landmark exhibition looking at the role of Black men in art, specifically contemporary art. So I think today you can't, you can't really think about making an exhibition without thinking about your community and about what conversations you want to have with people.
Thanks, Matthew. Antwaun, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in sort of the context of Black Male and the 90s, that Whitney Biennial, it's like those shows were like slaughtered. Like you go back and you read like you go back and you read the reviews, if you want to call them that. And what strikes me, like as someone who was 2 years old when that show happened, is that today those shows are seen as seminal transitionary shows in where we are in art, and those shows, without those shows, we would not be where we are, right? So to be clear, without those shows and Thelma and Matthew and the Whitney and all of those curators and that educational staff and those sort of culture workers taking the brunt, it sort of hit on those shows at the time, right? We would not have a space for Virgil Abloh to be able to do this type of show, right? And so I think a lot for me, and I say that because I think that for me, that those moments, right, are important when I'm thinking about sort of doing shows, whether that's a gallery, whether that's in a museum space or some other, cultural space, is that like, what context are you trying to sort of operate in? And how do you bring that context with you, when you're sort of thinking about what type of work you want to do in these spaces, right? Because I think that like that's important to me, and I'm always thinking about that. I'm always like, when I have a question or so, I'm fortunate to know Thelma and fortunate to know Anne and Matthew, one of the conversations even that me and Matthew had was like, I emailed him and I said, I really loved that Dior show. I'd love to talk to you. We were doing a very different show, but it was one of the things where like, it's like you did something that was really great in this space. You know how this space works. I'm doing, somewhat of a fashion show. It's different by, it's a very, different show, but what, and we had a conversation, we talked through it, and that was sort of helpful. And so I think that like, for me, it's always sort of thinking through, this notion of community, but also this notion of like, who's doing the thing or who did something that you really respond to, whether you want to do it that way or not, but to sort of have those dialogues and reach out and to say, I see the work and I, want to just get your perspective on what I'm doing, whether I agree with the perspective or take it or whatever. I'm sort of always open for that sort of exchange, whether I'm sort of reading something historically or whether I'm sort of engaging with sort of makers, exhibition makers and artists, and sort of the present day. I think that is like invaluable. And I encourage, everyone, to do that, to reach out, to sort of, look at those shows, go to things and just like even like, I always find myself just going to shows that like, sometimes I don't even have necessarily interest in, but there's something that like, or like in terms of the content or the artist, but it's like, oh, but I like the way that they designed that show. Let me, like there's something you can sort of find in sort of each and every show. And I just felt like I spent like, 10 years just like going to see everything that I could possibly see, and just reading and, and just like, I would not suggest anyone do this, but at the time I was really broke and could not, like afford this book because it was like $300. But the Black Male catalog, I was like, this is a seminal show. I need to sort of see this catalog. I can't find anywhere. It's out of print. It's all these things. So I found a library that had it in New York, and I went and I got it. And I returned it. I eventually returned it because I could paid a $300 for the book eventually. It was selling for online, but I just like went and I got it and I like made sure, I think I read that catalog 3 or 4 times, you know, like, and just like and then they made photocopies of it and all this stuff. And I returned to that show a lot just because it so informs the work that I do, you know, sort of with Black artists and you know, and again, it's not about sort of recreating anybody's work, but it's about sort of being in conversation with that work because there is a context, right? And like the last thing you want to do is to, you know, at least I have a fear of is, you know, sort of thinking that like I am sort of not existing in a context and that like I'm sort of doing something new because I'm, you know, 33 and, you know, whatever, you know, like, and so I'm always sort of trying to be aware of the context. I'm trying to be aware of who is around me, but also who came before, because I think that, you know, memory is short and, you know, we're often denied rights to our histories. And so I'm always trying to sort of think about that and evoke those histories. And, you know, even, you know, Virgil does that he had done that all the time in his practice. You know, you have everything from Felix Gonzalez Torres, you know, Perfect Lovers reference, you know, to When It's Clockwork, to the Mies van der Rohe, to the David Hammonds, to the, you know, you have all of that because I think it makes for a richer experience. And so, you know, I don't think I exactly answered your question, but it's, you know, that's how I'm sort of thinking about the world and thinking about sort of, you know, the world in relationship to sort of the way that I curate and the way that I, you know, sort of are making my contributions to, you know, what we call the art world.
Thanks, Antwaun, and thanks, Matthew. That was a great question, and those are really terrific answers. We've got time for one final one, and what we'll do, Anya and I will kind of offline try to answer the others, and maybe with some help from the two of you. But the question from Fabio is, what do you guys both think is the most important thing that Virgil has taught each of you? Matthew, I'll ask you that first.
Well, you know, I think that the aspect of Virgil's work that I have connected with a lot and maybe been a source of inspiration for me has really been his DJing. And you know, I'll never forget during COVID when the Met Gala was supposed to happen, and instead they had a virtual DJ session with Virgil and he was in Wisconsin or Chicago or Michigan or something. And you just kind of really felt like, even though it wasn't happening, we were all kind of connected through the internet, and we were, you know, and Virgil was there with us. And I feel like sometimes there are artists who their work, you feel them in it. And I really feel like Virgil's one of those artists. And so when you go through the show, you really feel his personality and who he is, and his thought process is so visible. And he allows you into his personal space in a way that I find very inspiring. So, you know, I don't know that I could ever pick just one piece of any artist's work, but I feel like for me, it's perhaps Virgil's spirit.
Lovely, thank you, Matthew. What about you, Antwaun, in terms of something that, you know, has stayed with you, you've learned?
I think in terms of the artwork, like there's a work, I don't even know if it's art, I wouldn't even describe it as artwork. There's this piece of homework that he did. He went to Ghana and he took a picture of his little kid outside of this red building. It's like the 3rd or 4th thing in the exhibition. And then what he did was design this youth center from that image, but for that kid, right? Imagining, right? Sort of projecting to the future, like what would a space be for this kid, right? And he's in college, and you know, and again, he's driving by, like the perspective of the image is like driving by, took this image, you know, and then sort of at the bottom, he said art, fashion, design, etc. And I was like, wow, he was like, even then, even when he had no resources, had nothing, had built nothing, had designed nothing, had, you know, he was thinking about what space he wanted to sort of create for others, right? So that's one thing, right? And so I think about that all the time with him, you know, and then I think about sort of what really sort of stays with me is Tyler, the Creator's memorial. I went to the memorial at MCA Chicago in December, and Tyler, Creator got up there and really sort of just like described to a T who he was fundamentally as a person. Tyler, Creator, this rapper and designer, and really close to Virgil, and was a mentor. Virgil was a mentor to him. And he called Virgil one day, he, you know, is his telling, and he said, I have this idea for this brand. It's called Golf, but I have no idea how to do this. You know, like I don't know, you know, I just have no idea. I know I have the images in my mind, but I have no idea, you know? And Virgil said, give me a week and I'll call you back. And he goes true to his word. A week later, he calls and he has product designers and factories and, you know, on the line, and he's on every call with him, right? I mean, the guy's busy, right? Like, you know, that he would always say, I'm down the fly, you know, and he just flew, which I thought was hilarious because he was just on planes all the time. And, you know, to just have someone just like not to pass, you know, someone off, your friend off and say, just talk to this person, you know, whatever, good luck, you know, and to be on the call and to be on, you know, in every meeting with him for something like he had no stake in this brand, right? And so like that was the sort of like, I was like, you know, when you make a commitment to someone, you know, and to, you know, your ideas, you know, really, you know, it's like just have the fidelity to it, really, you know. And I think like that was the thing that sort of kept coming up in just all these small and large ways with him, was that, you know, he was I mean, if you ever knew him, he was an extraordinarily patient person, despite all of the chaos he was sort of releasing on the world. And, you know, and it was just sort of remarkable to see in all these different contexts, people talk about how he showed up for them, you know, not the other way around, right? Not say, it was never, I did this for Virgil, or it was always he showed up this way. You know, even Oana, who's his collaborator architect at Harvard, you know, the day before, you know, the morning before he was signing his Louis Vuitton contract, he goes up to Harvard and gives a lecture, right? And, you know, and he's like, all right, got to get out of here. I got to go to New York, and goes back and then signs the contract or whatever. And, you know, just making time, right? You like that. I can't sort of stress that enough around how that is so rare in this world. I mean, it is extraordinarily rare, particularly in the art world where, you know, everyone is sort of in their own sort of bubble and thinking about their own practice and their own projects. And I'm not saying that's not a way to sort of work in the world, but there is something truly special about someone who can see beyond their own shadow and, you know, really sort of see other people and see the potential in other creatives and sort of work to make that potential a reality. And that was Virgil Abloh.
That's a perfect ending to a really wonderful session, Antwaun and Matthew. Thank you both for the gift of your time and just your thoughts. I know on behalf of everybody who's listening and everyone who will view this afterwards, it's really, really powerful. So thanks to you both, and have a wonderful, cool weekend. Anya, thanks for facilitating this. Again, thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Antwaun.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Okay.